We gave 6 Princeton students a map of Europe and a map of the world and asked them some questions to find out what they knew about the Cold War. Did they know which countries were part of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, or which were neutral? Did they know where around the globe areas of tension, proxy wars, and communist containment zones were? Did they know which countries that weren't formally in NATO still supported the West? We looked at their maps and then discussed them in class. We will share the results with you, and at the end, show you the correct answer for each map. With the map of the world, we got very different answers. One student put only the US and the USSR. Another student was better, understanding some of the countries involved and identifying areas of conflict like Cuba, Vietnam, Korea, and East and West Germany. The last map was the best, however, with the student identifying much of South America, Cuba, Vietnam, Korea, China, East and West Germany, and Greece and Turkey. Although the student did the best, he still missed many areas. It is clear that the students did not understand how global the conflict really was.
The 6 maps, the biggest thing that I noticed about all of them is that nobody mentioned Africa on any of them, and there were, in all the anti-colonial uprisings, there was lots of proxy wars like Congo, where the USSR were supplying weapons and troops to Africa, and so was the US, so the fact that nobody mentioned anything about Africa was quite surprising.
Central and South America are also pretty blank. Only one person thought to kind of show all the various coups and uprisings and tension that existed in that region during the Cold War. And 5 out of 6 people did mention kind of Cuba, kind of reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis and obviously the tension between NATO and Warsaw forces there.
Latin America is one of the prime areas of containment of communism. You see Operation Condor, where the U.S. funded military dictatorships and juntas who overthrew democratically elected governments in the southern cone of South America.
Subject of conflicts that might be more in public consciousness. It's sort of interesting that there's not a lot of attention paid to either Afghanistan or Syria, even though recently we've been seeing the effects of Soviet influence in both those countries.
No one really touched on the fact that Australia, New Zealand, and Japan were all clearly sort of part of the American sphere of influence, and the fact that there, in addition to Vietnam, were other conflicts in Southeast Asia with proxy war overtones in Malaysia and Indonesia. The issues in the Middle East that linger today, the U.S. sort of funding coup in Iran that later backfired on them, as well as Soviet support for governments like Egypt and Syria during the 1960s and 70s that still has repercussions today.
And the general perception is that there is like this East and West divide, like U.S. and Western Europe against the USSR and their that sphere of influence. But it's also important to realize that in South America, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia, there were other countries that were affected and ended up forming their own alliance through OPEC. We also see through some readings that there were conferences that attempted to help these countries gain political and economic influence.
The destitution that was left in South America and Africa and in parts of Asia as well, as a byproduct of this war of ideologies, is something that isn't recognized, but still kind of fits into this context of this bipolar world.
Here is the correct map of the world showing the areas of conflict around the globe and which countries were allied with the NATO and Warsaw Pacts. With regards to conflicts, we see that there were many more conflicts throughout the globe than people thought. Every single continent except for Australia experienced wars or conflicts. In South America, the US sponsored operations in countries like Guatemala, Chile, and Brazil in order to contain communism. In Africa, colonies like the Congo and Angola experienced support from the US and USSR as they rose up against their European colonists. In the Middle East, conflicts like the Iranian Revolution and the Lebanese Civil War occurred. In Southeast Asia, we obviously had the Vietnam War, but also the Cambodian Civil War and the Laos Civil War. Europe faced the conflict in East and West Germany, while North America faced the possibility of war in Cuba during the Missile Crisis. Finally, in Northern Asia, there was the Korean War and many areas of tension throughout China. As you can see by the red and blue, almost the entire world was in support of one bloc or another, even if they weren't formally part of NATO or the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War was much larger and more complex than most people believe, and it is important to note how devastating it was to some areas and how tensions in some areas still linger today. With the map of Europe, many students struggled to correctly identify which countries belonged to which blocks. This student did not know Ireland, Yugoslavia, Finland, Sweden, and Austria were neutral, that Iceland was in NATO, and that Greece and Turkey were not part of the Warsaw Pact. In this map, you see the student only identified 5 communist countries, saying that Bulgaria and East Germany were part of NATO. There was also confusion with Yugoslavia, Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, and Norway. In the final map, the student identified all the Warsaw Pact countries except Austria, which was neutral. But again, there was confusion in Greece and Turkey, Iceland, Portugal, Ireland, and Norway.
Zoomed in maps of Europe that people filled out, we see that there's a lot of confusion between there's certain neutral countries that were identified as either NATO or Warsaw Pact affiliated, and you can kind of see from that even though there were neutral countries here, and even outside of this sphere there was the third world countries, there is this perception that it is a really bipolar conflict.
People kind of create this bipolar divide between East and West, failing to recognize the neutral countries that existed in Europe, such as Ireland and Switzerland and Yugoslavia.
I think it's interesting the varied responses that people put down for Greece and Turkey, especially because these are areas that were so important to kind of the strategy of containment, and when justifying the Marshall Plan, Truman kind of referenced the kind of ideological struggle going on in this area, and I think that one reason why maybe 2 people put down that it was part of the communist bloc would have been that there's kind of this, we're asking American students to fill out these maps, and there's this kind of maybe idea that a lot of the countries that maybe were against us in World War II, you have the kind of the predisposed nation to kind of nature to assume that those same countries are going to be in a separate bloc from us in the Cold War conflict as well.
Another interesting thing worth mentioning is that out of the 6 maps, I think one person put Yugoslavia as neutral in the bottom left, and everyone else affiliated them with one bloc or the other, when nominally they were neutral, although they were a communist country, but definitely not part of the Warsaw Pact.
Ireland, 2 people said it was neutral and 4 people said it was NATO, so those 4 people were wrong. And then you have a lot of confusion with the Scandinavian countries as well. People either said that all 3 of them were neutral or all 3 of them were part of NATO, but it was only Norway that was part of NATO, so that's also interesting.
Here's the correct map of Europe, showing the alliances during the Cold War. The only neutral countries were Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, Finland, and Yugoslavia. Many students incorrectly thought that Yugoslavia was part of the Warsaw Pact, and that countries like Ireland, Sweden, or Finland were part of NATO. There was lots of trouble with Iceland, Greece, Turkey, and Norway, and these were all part of NATO. As we can see in this map, most of the tension in Europe would have been centered around East and West Germany and in the Greece and Turkey region, as they bordered both NATO and the Warsaw Pact.